Shortly after I became the executive director in Alaska, I went down to a national conference in New Orleans, and Joe played host to all of us from around the country and did a very fine job. And then, unfortunately, about 2 weeks later, Katrina came along, and we were seeing pictures from the very site where we had been having this ACLU confab, and then just the tragic pictures that came out of that city after that. I think must have been the greatest challenge, Joe, that you have faced in your years with the ACLU. I can't imagine anything tougher than dealing with that situation. Thank you all for having me here. The immigration issue, as Ken alluded to, is really one of those that is a model issue for a challenge to the ACLU. It implicates every single aspect of this organization. Everybody knows the ACLU for its litigators, and we have an immigrants' rights project based out on the West Coast that has been very active in all aspects of immigrants' rights litigation. We in the Washington Legislative Office also have a piece of it, although, you know what, I think relatively speaking it's a smaller piece of it just because of the political realities of the immigrant situation. There's not a lot that we can get done proactively on that right now, but there's a big role for us to play in this overall discussion. And perhaps most importantly is the role that the affiliates have to play all across the country. This is where the center of the battle is, and in some ways Virginia is at the center of that battle because of a lot of the local issues that have been raised. The immigrants' rights issue takes a lot of different forms. It is the more blatant sort of discrimination or subtle discrimination that sometimes you'll see reported on in the news, but it's also the less subtle, the more subtle forms. For example, there was a recent court case out of the U.S. Supreme Court out of Indiana on the requirement to present a voter identification before voters can vote. Well, you know, I think the subtext of that whole thing has to do with whether we want people that look and talk differently actually voting. Do you want to make it easy or hard for people to participate in the political process? There is absolutely, in that voter identification case, there is absolutely no demonstration at the state legislative level that there had been in-person voter fraud taking place. Nevertheless, the law was passed. Some would say the law was passed so that you would reduce the participation of people of a certain political party. Other people said, no, 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 we're just trying to stop voter fraud or stop it before it starts. What's the answer? I can't stand here and tell you what the right answer is, but I'm saying that something like that, I think, is tangentially, at least, related to this entire discussion of immigrant rights. I will postulate that the immigrants' rights issue is one that we can talk about in a mature fashion. And if we can talk about it in a mature fashion without resorting to demagoguery, which I think both sides have done to a certain extent, especially one side, you know, I think there are ways that we can advance the ball on immigrants' rights. But the demagoguery is really getting in the way right now. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges. And so aside from having the litigators and having the national legislative folks and having the affiliate folks on both the state legislative level and the state litigation level engaging in this issue, we also need people to be talking about the issue. The public education effort in the immigration issue, I think, is critical. The more we talk about it, the more information that gets out there, the more good, accurate information that gets out there, I think the easier it'll be to advance this thing down the road. With that, you know, this is not a new issue, right? I'm a little worried. I don't want anybody to participate in this that doesn't want to, but anybody here have relatives that came over on the Mayflower? Okay. How about around the time of the formation of the country, around 1800, around that area? How about around 1900? That's right. And how about in the last 50 years? Immigration is at the core of this country, along with our standards of fairness and equity. Immigration is right. Without immigration, well, we as this kind of country would not exist. there would be Native Americans, and they would be in charge, right? And some would say that would be better. I think we can start a whole different fight about that. Abraham Lincoln wrote about 5 years before he was elected to a fellow named Joshua Speed. He says, "As a nation, we began by declaring that all men are created equal. We now practically read it, all men are created equal except Negroes. When the know-nothings get control, it will read all men are created equal except Negroes and foreigners and Catholics." This issue has been an issue facing our nation since its founding and before. And people have had to deal with it in different ways, but we do know that throughout our history there have been instances of discrimination against immigrants. And so the question is, how do we, as an organization, as the ACLU, how do we deal with it? I'm going to ramble on for about 15 minutes. I'm going to postulate a few things. I'm going to talk a little bit about the relatively narrow piece that the Washington Legislative Office deals with on this issue, and then open it up for questions. And so that's my intention for this afternoon. ACLU's got a long history. We go back to 1920-ish, thereabouts. But one of the first fights that we were involved with relates to the Palmer Raids. Palmer Raids in the 1920s, and that had to do with immediate deportation of Southern and Eastern Europeans, largely. This is one of those issues that the ACLU has been involved with in one fashion or another since its beginning. Yet some would say that we don't have the same sort of constitutional founding for our involvement in the immigration issue that we do in some of the other things. How does this relate to due process? How does this relate to our First Amendment fights? How does this relate to our fights over freedom of religion? Well, there's an argument there that immigrants have a different legal standard applied to them, whether rightly or wrongly. But immigrants do have constitutional rights. Nobody can tell you anything differently. Now, their citizens have certain additional rights, privileges, and immunities. But the key word that's used throughout, Fifth Amendment, 14th Amendment in particular, talks about persons having rights. And say what you will about immigrants, most of them are people. I would say maybe all of them. And so therefore, there are aspects of our country that immigrants, non-immigrants, whatever semantics you want to use, that folks can take advantage of. They are entitled to those rights. And then you start arguing around the edges about when do those rights apply. But those rights exist, and so it's up to us to figure out when they apply. That's the thing that gives the ACLU the in on this issue. Because immigrants are politically disenfranchised, though, that puts them in a unique position that I think gives ACLU an even greater in on this issue. Because they're politically disenfranchised, they are not entitled to vote. They are, almost by definition, more vulnerable in some aspects than those of us who are citizens. And so, therefore, it becomes incumbent on the ACLU to take up its traditional role of protecting those who are the most vulnerable in our society. And because many immigrants, anyway, look different than the majority, speak differently than the majority, there tends to be, throughout our history, this sort of discrimination that, again, triggers another way for the ACLU to get involved. If we're not involved in discrimination activity, anti-discrimination activities, what are we involved in?